special edition happens to be Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av today. So I thought, just like last year, we spoke about a specific topic on Tisha B'Av. I thought today, because a very, very solemn day, we'll speak about the cruel Hebron Massacre that actually occurred in the year 1929. This occurred, very, very highly documented. We can use articles from Aish websites and from various other sources, also using the internet, and we will take this away over here. And just an interesting article I found on the Aish Torah website, which is a brilliant resource. I think it's actually written originally by Toby Klein Greenwald, if I'm not mistaken. I think this was recorded, this article itself was from about maybe written many years ago, maybe more than 10 years ago. But happened to be, it was an Arab mob that actually went on a rampage and murdered 69 Jews. Obviously, nothing like the levels it was on October the 7th, but let's unfortunately have to recount it. It's Tisha B'Av, and just show the anti-Semitism all throughout Jewish history and how we should listen to the story, try and get closer to Hashem, and Bezrat Hashem, just see better times for all over the world. So I think it was on August the 23rd, 1929, the day before the Hebron Massacre. There was rumors were circulating about anticipated riots. But of the 700 Jews who lived in Hebron, most did not believe anything bad would happen to them. Remember, Hebron is one of the 4 holy cities of Israel, along with Tiberias, Tzfat, and Jerusalem. They considered their relations with their Arab neighbors to be strong based upon years of friendship and shared experiences. Moreover, the Arab governor of Hebron, Abdullah Karados, had promised the Jews that they would not be harmed. So there was a reassurance over here. Now, according to first-hand accounts recorded in Sefer Hebron, the most comprehensive book on the history of Hebron, some Jewish notables in the city, among them was Eliezer Dan Slonim. Let's say he was a manager of the Hebron branch of the Anglo-Palestine Bank, and the son of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Slonim, who I think was a chief rabbi of Hebron, the Ashkenazi one. He met to discuss the situation. When they couldn't resolve their differences of opinion, they went to consult with Rabbi Meir Franco. He was, I believe, the chief rabbi, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Hebron at that stage in time. I've spoken to him on this series, I believe, on various occasions before. And together they decided to bring the Jews who were scattered in outlying areas to homes in the city centre where they thought it would be safer. So there was this pre-plan, let's just say before. As they walked out of the meeting, they were met with a barrage of stones thrown by Arab youths. Yet shortly after the Arabs finished their Friday prayers, Arab notables came to Slonim to reassure him that no harm would come to the Jews of Hebron. Now, these notables, let's say, were either misinformed or misinforming. Now, at 2:30 it was on the Friday afternoon, a young Arab on a bicycle coming from Jerusalem called out to the Arabs of Hebron that the Jews were murdering thousands of Arabs in Jerusalem. This was obviously a total lie, a blood libel. Other Arabs in cars followed him, shouting that Jews were attacking Arabs, rather than vice versa, as it was in reality. This was what was happening. Now, according to the Martyrs of Hebron, which I think was written by someone with the name Leo Gottesman, who was a student, let's just say, at the famous Yeshivat Slobodka, but was not present at the time of the massacre. The author's brother was on his way back to Hebron for Shabbat in a cab filled with Arabs. When he saw them eyeing him and snickering, he realized that something was afoot. When his hat blew out on the open window, he used it as an excuse to leave the cab and escape to Jerusalem. The riots were hardly spontaneous. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin, and Al-Husseini, who would, I think, in the ensuing years offer help to Hitler, had been preaching venomously against the Jews. In 1924, the Muslim Waqf began the instigating against the Jewish people connected to the Kotel. And in 1928, the Mufti further provoked a dispute about the Kotel, claiming that the Jews were trying to take control of the mosques of the Temple Mount. And the Muslims argued that the Kotel was holy to them because Muhammad had tied his horse there before he went up to the Temple Mount. To this day, in fact, the Muslims call the pogroms of 1929 the pogroms of the horse. This was reported over here on the article. Now, on Erev Tisha B'Av, 1929, a week before the Hebron Massacre, a large demonstration was held by Jews in the plaza before the Kotel in an attempt to affirm the Jewish connection to the Kotel, to the Western Wall. In the aftermath of the demonstration, the Mufti encouraged riots around the country. To what extent he encouraged them, and to what extent he actually orchestrated them, is a matter for research, according to Aryeh Klein. I believe he orchestrated them, says Klein, but it is difficult to prove. Since the British were blatantly pro-Arab, he was able to stir them up unhindered. In Motzah, for example, a suburb of Jerusalem, there was the cruel murder of the Maklef family. They were murdered the day before the Hebron Massacre. One of the 3 children who survived, Mordechai Maklef, became the 4th chief of staff of the IDF. Now, Hebron Jews were particularly vulnerable since they had made the city more modern, and economically prosperous, while the Arabs who wanted modernity regarded the Jewish presence as a blessing. Those who didn't despised the Jews and led the incitement. Yes, I say these are all sourced on the H websites, which I recommend everyone to look at. An angry Arab mob gathered at the home of the deputy police commander of Hebron and took to the streets. At the same time, the elderly Rav Slonim was on his way to Captain Kafer, who happened to be the British police commander of Hebron. He was attacked and beaten by the mob. Another British police commander who stood behind the mob was approached by a Jewish woman and asked to intervene. It's usually the Jews who are to blame in these things, he said, stirring up the Arab crowd even more. Rav Slonim turned to an Arab police commander for help, who shoved him away with his horse. It was almost Shabbat. Some Arabs broke into Hebron's Slobodka yeshiva, which was mercifully almost empty. As of the 150 students, many were either on summer vacation or were preparing for Shabbat. The mob murdered the one student they found there, Shmuel Rosenholz, a conscious young yeshiva student who had prepared for Shabbat early and came to yeshiva to review the Torah portion, the Parashat Shavua. As the Arabs made their way back through the streets, an Arab who had participated in the murder of Rabbi Rosenholz boasted, "Too bad we went to yeshiva and found only one boy. Tomorrow the number will be higher." You can see the disgraceful anti-Semitism were there. This is all sourced on the H website. A terrified quiet ensued. The morning hours brought bloody and brutal horror. Frenzied Arab mobs with axes, knives, and iron bars screamed to murder the Jews. They broke into the homes and stabbed and mutilated the Jews they found. The mob that rampaged through the city included respected Arab merchants and, let's say, the neighbors that might have been considered good neighbors, who killed their friends, clients, and business associates. Torah scrolls were burned. The Hadassah building, where Arabs were treated free of charge, was broken into, and all the medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies were destroyed. A video database of survivor testimonies, I think, appeared on the website of the present-day Hebron community. I'm not sure if it's still up. Hebron.com, Hebron.com. The testimonies in Hebrew were compiled by David Wilder, the site's creator, and there's a whole collection over here that we're going to just recount over here. We're going to quote from the collection itself. There was from Rachel Graziani. It stated over, on that same Black Shabbat, when Imma took out the Chamin, the children, we heard screams and we looked through the window and saw a mad mob of people, enemies, Arabs, and father moved us away from the window and pushed something against the door. They didn't succeed in getting through the door. And then, with the belief that they were friends and would do nothing to us, he said, I'll open the door if you take anything you want and don't hurt anyone. And he opened it. They pulled him outside, and leading the mob was his friend from work. Later, when the British took us away, I saw my father downstairs. Fortunately, he was murdered. I will not forget that. That's what he said. I remember my mother holding my brother, only a few months old, and an Arab tried to stab her. My mother said, are you not afraid of God? He won't forget that you are going to kill a woman and a boy, and he left her. My grandmother, who someone tried to rape, she was, this was quoted over in the website, she was of good appearance, but she was also strong, also said, aren't you afraid of God? And he left her alone. It was a horrifying scene. We went up to the roof and hid there. We heard the screams, we heard everything. We were like terrified rabbits hiding. The mob went from house to house. The British and Arab policemen stood by, watching the terrible crimes taking place. Some of the Arab policemen even spurred the rioters on, or participated in the riots. In the home of a man, Eliezer Dan Slonim, alone, where many people had gathered, thinking that they would be safe there. There were 22 men, still wrapped in their talitot, I think prayer shawls, as to say. There was women and children. They were murdered, including Eliezer Dan himself, his wife Hannah, one of their children, and Hannah's parents. Sorry, I start to cry here. It's Tisha B'Av. We should be crying. We want the rebuilding of the third Beit HaMikdash, and we see all these anti-Semitic stories that occurred all throughout the years. You can't help to cry, unfortunately. Hannah's sisters and the yeshiva student were miraculously saved because he shoved her into a closet, and he held her mouth closed so she wouldn't scream when she saw through the crack her parents, unfortunately, being murdered. Many sought refuge with Slonim, since he was known to have good connections with both the British and the Arabs, but the mob was specifically looking to murder the rich and connected. In the home of Gershon Ben Sion, he was a Hebron pharmacist. The mob gouged out his eyes and stabbed him over again. They cut off his hands of his wife and fatally wounded her. They also tried to torture his daughter, but she resisted with all her might, and they murdered her in a strange and cruel way. That's what's quoted over. Through the hills of Hebron, the screams of tortured and maimed Jews mixed with the shrieks of the satanic mob, howling like wild animals over their prey. There were also stories of Arabs who risked their own lives to save Jews. So there were, let's say, good stories also from that day. There was Rivka Slominberg, the daughter of Rav Slonim, and the daughter of Eliezer Dan Slonim, recalls that before the massacre, there were good relations with Arabs in the area. We were even invited to each other's, let's say, celebrations, joyous occasions. She was only 8 years old when, together with the rest of her immediate family, she would hide behind Abu Shachar, the Arab neighbor who stood in the doorway of her family's home in Hebron, protecting them from the mob. Rav Slonim and his family lived in a two-family house, and Abu Shachar was their landlord. When our landlord heard that something was happening in the city, he came and stood in the entrance of the house, recalls Rivka. Abu Shachar told the marauders that they would pass through that door to murder the Jews over his dead body. We heard what he said to the mob while he stood at the entrance. They, the Arab mobs, at that point in time, wounded him, but they didn't go into the house at the end. After the massacre, the British took everyone to the police station, but my father, a rabbi, would not ride there on Shabbat, said Rivka. So we went on foot, and we saw the bodies, pieces of limbs, and blood along the way. Rav Slonim, he died in 1937 in the mourning for family and his community that had died in the massacre. Letters reprinted in Sefer Hebron reveal, however, that after the massacre, Rav Slonim persisted in trying to restore the Jewish presence in Hebron. There was an official committee formed to help the Jews return to Hebron. Havad Ezra Plitim, I think, the committee to help refugees, but they didn't really facilitate their returning. Nevertheless, there were Jews who returned in the year 1931. Rivka, who spent the rest of her childhood in Jerusalem, later married the late minister Yosef Berg of the National Religious Party Mizrahi. Right after the Six-Day War, she returned with her husband to visit Hebron. There she looked for the family that had saved her. All the original residents of the city ran away during the Six-Day War because they were afraid that the Jews would take revenge, but we found one of the sons, Abu Shachar, who had stayed to watch over the family's possessions, says Rivka. He had since died. We, my husband, my sister, and I all stood around him. Suddenly he asked, "Where is Rivka?" He was very emotional. Not very much is left from my Hebron, this is what Rivka is saying. The Arabs destroyed the home of my married brother, Eliezer Dan Slonim. My school had been in that area. The Arabs built a shopping area there. There was an aftermath of what's happened. When the mob was through, there were 69 dead and scores wounded. More than 20 of the dead were yeshiva students. The surviving Jews were taken to the police headquarters located in Beit Romana, which today, let's say, houses Shivat Shavei Hebron. And from there, the wounded and dead were removed to the government health ministry. I'm just going to move the chair here. Tisha B'Av. I'm recording this live here on Tisha B'Av, so we sit on low seats over here as we are recounting the story of this terrible pogrom what happened in Hebron all these years, in 1929. According to Sefer Hebron, the survivors remained for 2 days and under the eyes of the British, without food, lying in blood and filth, in deeper shock, until they were finally able to pull themselves together enough to buy pitot, bread. The Arab doctors in the government health ministry building were not interested in helping the wounded. 36 hours after the massacre, a British surgeon with an assistant and 2 nurses came from Jerusalem to take care of the many, many wounded. Eventually, the survivors were taken to Hadassah Hospital, then on Strauss Street in Jerusalem, where they were met by hundreds of anguished Jews who came to comfort them and mourn them. On Sunday evening, the Jews wanted to start burying their dead in Hebron. There were 5 long graves dug, called Kever Achim, the tomb of the brothers. The bodies were placed in order in these graves, and in the last one were placed unidentified body parts. Footnotes, I think the Sefer Hebron in page number 417. According to David Wilder, Hebron's spokesperson for the foreign press, all the bodies were identified and laid out in order and recorded, and they were markers in order. The markers there today are as they were in 1929. I think this is actually quoted from David Wilder back in April 23rd, 2004. At some point between 1948 and 1967, when Hebron was under Jordanian rule, Arabs dug up the grave sites and used it as a vegetable garden. You can see how terrible it was. After the 6-day war, the Israelites rebuilt the cemetery and reconstructed the gravestones. 1 week after the massacre, 24 Jews were murdered in Tzfat. Before the British intervened, the Arabs began to burn Tzfat Jewish quarter, but the Jews of Tzfat were stronger and more organized than those in Hebron. And when the British brought trucks to take them away, and as they had done with the Jews of Hebron, the Tzfat Jews insisted on staying in their burnt homes. After the massacre, which came to be known as the Oraot Tarpat, the events of 5689, Rav Frankel and Rav Slonim made a list of those Arabs who saved the Jews during the massacre. The list is published along with other documents in Sefer Hebron, out of a community of 18,000 Arabs. There are 19 names on the list. Sefer Hebron includes the summation of the protocol from the trials, which know that only 5 Arabs were brought to trial. The 2 judges were an Englishman and an Arab. The prosecutor was an Arab, a relative of Jerusalem Mufti. Sheikh Talab Maraka, the leader of the murderous mobs, was given a 2-year jail sentence but sat in jail only for 1 month. The British used various legal tricks in order to bring as few murderers as possible to trial. But 3 Arabs were hung in Hebron. These Arabs are considered national heroes by the Palestinians, and during the First Intifada, which commenced in 1987, Arabs throughout Judea and Samaria held a strike day in their memory, and they held a special memorial for them in Hebron. You can see how disgraceful the anti-Semitism has been. The British censored all newspapers and did not allow anything to be printed about the events of Tarpat, officially because it would encourage other pogroms. However, in an ironic twist, pamphlets and books were not censored, so newspapers circumvented the censorship by producing special pamphlets such as Davar Hayamim Ha'ele, the word on these days, published by Davar. In September 1929, the secretaries of the Arab executive distributed a paper throughout Palestine, and the world titled Scandals of Jewish Propaganda, which stated that no mutilations and no atrocities of Hebron occurred. It also accused the Jews of publishing lies about the Arabs of Hebron to deceive public opinion, collect more money, and reflect negatively on the dignity and honor of the Arabs. The Hebron Massacre was a landmark in the history of the Yishuv. Before 1929, the Yishuv thought that British would protect the Jews. After the massacre, the Jews understood that they would have to take care of themselves, and Haganah, which had been a small organization, began for the first time to fulfill a military function. Today there's a small museum in Hebron commemorating the events of Tarpat. It would be donated by Rebbitzin Gittel Rosenzweig of Toronto in the early 1990s in memory of her husband, Rabbi Fable Rosenzweig. In a cruel twist of irony, Gittel's son-in-law, David Rosenzweig, was murdered on July 14, 2002 in Toronto by skinheads. You can see more anti-Semitism. Okay, now from 1948 onwards, the Jews of Hebron maintained a public, let's say, association, Va'ad Kilat Yudei Hebron, the Committee for the Kehillah of the Jews of Hebron. The judge Moshe Hassan, who had been a resident of Hebron, was the head of the committee that continued to function in 1950s and beyond. After the Six-Day War in 1967, during which at that point in time Hebron came into Israel's hands, they went to the Israeli government to try to have their property in Hebron returned to them, but nothing came of it. On Pesach 1968, the Jews returned to resettle the area. Kiryat Arba was built on the adjoining hill in 1971. In 1979, Jews moved back into Hebron proper, where the massacre had occurred. Today, the Jewish community in that area lives in homes that were public Jewish property, or in new homes built on grounds that were public Jewish property, homes that were owned by the congregation, the community, at the time of the massacre. This includes the entire Jewish quarter. Now, even Chabad was the only exception. It is considered public, even though it was originally private, because it is owned by the Shirson family, but the Rebbe handed it over for the use of the Jewish settlement in Hebron. There are Jews living in the Beit Schneerson today. 300 yeshivas study in Yeshivat Shavei Hebron in Beit Romano, where the survivors of Hebron Massacre had once gathered. I think there's a large article actually on this in the Jewish Action appeared in the magazine of OU in summer of 2004 edition. This was, so they quote various different things, especially from Sefer Hebron in this article, and I recommend everyone to read this excellent article, in-depth article in the Aish website over here. And there's a big feature in Wikipedia also, which speaks within regards to this. They actually add the city of Hebron. Obviously, this holds a huge significance, both in Judaism and Islam. Obviously, the tomb of the patriarchs, Adam, Chava, Abraham, Sarah, Yaakov Avinu, also Leah and Yaakov are buried over there, and Yitzchak and Rivka is also buried there. It was considered like a ghetto to some degree, where the Jewish community was living in Hebron, and hopefully one stage we will, at one stage in time, we will actually visit Hebron itself. The Jewish community was divided. The Ashkenazi community was quite recently inhabited in Hebron before 1929, coming from Europe, and other populations descended mostly from Sephardic Jews who had inhabited the town for 800 years beforehand. The Ashkenazi Jews had established in the town for at least a century at that stage in time. What's interesting, I think, about that stage in time in Hebron, there were separate schools for Sephardim and Ashkenazim. They were separate synagogues also. And really, most Sephardim would marry Sephardim, and Ashkenazim would marry Ashkenazim. So it was very separated. If we look at it, a demographic in Hebron during that year. The Sephardics, let's say, were Arab speakers. They wore Arab dress and were very well integrated. Whereas most of the Ashkenazi community were yeshiva students who maintained, let's say, it was more difficult. There was difficulties and misunderstandings with the Arab population at that point in time, and there was tensions. I think there was differences in the Jewish communities also, because there was different worldviews. Let's just say traditionalism, culture, and ritual practice. Let's just say itself at that stage in time. Just to give some more, we spoke about the Western Wall at that point in time. I think we spoke in big detail within regards to that. The Haganah we spoke about would actually offer protection. I think former Haganah member Bor Katinka recalled that he had been informed by his superiors that 10 to 12 fighters were needed to protect the Jews of Hebron. On August the 20th, a group traveled in Hebron in the middle of the night and met with the Jewish community leader I mentioned before, Eliezer Dan Slonim. And Katinka said that Slonim was adamant that no protection was needed at that point in time, that we stated at the beginning of the article. And unfortunately, that we spoke about the Hebron police force over there. They weren't that much of a great help at that point in time. And we spoke about rampage and unfortunately the killing that actually took place. There was an account of various people. There's a man named Raymond Kafir Atta. After the massacre, he said, on hearing screams in the room, I went up a sort of tunnel passage and saw an Arab in the act of, I don't want to say it here, it's so devastating, where he tried to really cut off limbs with his sword, and he of a person over there. He had hit him, and let's say, was having another cut, but on seeing me, he tried to aim the stroke at me, but missed. He was probably on the muzzle of my rifle. I shot him low in the groin. Behind him was a Jewish woman, smothered, unfortunately, in blood, and the man I recognized as an Arab police constable named Issa Sharif from Jaffa. He was standing over the woman with a dagger in his hand. He saw me and bolted into the room, close by, and tried to shut me out, shouting in Arabic, "Your Honor, I'm a policeman." I got into the room and shot him. Over here, there's various different accounts, we said, of various different people. We spoke about some of the heroic Arabs over there that tried to save some of the Jewish people over there. We spoke about the trials, and the decline of the Jewish community actually occurred at that point in time in the Jewish community. Some Hebron Arabs, let's say, amongst whom the president of Hebron's Chamber of Commerce, Ahmed Rashid al-Hirabari, favored the return of Jews to the town. The returning Jews, let's just say, there was discussion with the Jewish agency of funding. The agency did not agree to the idea of reconstituting a mixed community, but rather pressed the establishment of a Jewish fortress, wholly distinct from the Arab quarters of Hebron. In spring 1931, 160 Jews would return together with Rabbi Chaim Bagayo. During the disturbances of 1936, they all left the town for good, except for one family, that of Yaakov ben Shalom Ezra, on an 18th generation Hebronite, who was a dairyman, who eventually left in 1947 on eve of the 1948 Independence War. The yeshiva relocated at the end after the massacre to Jerusalem. And yes, that's very interesting. We spoke about re-establishment after 1967 war. Many of the Jewish people would end up coming into Kiryat Arba. Descendants of the original Jewish community of Hebron were divided, with some claiming they wished to return, but only when Arab and Jewish residents can find a way to live together peacefully. 1996, 37 descendants of the pre-1929 community of Hebron, including 7 members of the Surim family, published a statement repudiating the new Hebron settlers, writing that these people are not the way of the life of the Hebron Jews, who created over the generations a culture of peace and understanding between peoples and faiths. And that was actually reported over. But many other, I must note over here, many survivors and descendants of survivors support the new Jewish community in Hebron. That's what's quoted over here. I think that's an article from the Jerusalem Post. Yeah, so legacy in the, let's say, the narrative of Zionism, according to Michel Campos, the event became a central symbol of Jewish persecution at the hands of, let's say, bloodthirsty Arabs, and was engraved into the national psyche of Israeli Jews, particularly those who settled Hebron after 1967. Hillel Cohen regards the massacre as a marking of a point of no return in Arab-Jewish relations and forcing the Mizrahi Jews to join forces with Zionism at that stage in time. That's what he's quoted over. It's interesting. Noit Geva, a daughter of a survivor, discovered that her grandmother, Zemira Mani, who was a granddaughter of Hebron's chief rabbi Eliyahu Mani, had written an account of the massacre. I think it was published in the Haaretz newspaper in 1929. In 1999, Geva released a film containing testimonies of 13 survivors that she and her husband, Dan, had managed to track down from this in Sefer Hebron. Now, I think there was a film, What I Saw in Hebron, the survivors, now very elderly, described pre-massacre Hebron as a kind of paradise surrounded by vineyards where Sephardic and Jews and Arabs lived in coexistence. The well-established Ashkenazi residents were also treated well, but let's say the Arabs' anger was roused by followers of the Jerusalem Mufti, as well as local chapters of Arab Muslim Christian societies. And it gives over various different accounts also within regards to it. We should maybe talk about it at a later stage more, because unfortunately we had all these massacres all throughout Jewish history. And we spoke about the chief rabbi of the time, and we'll try and speak a few more words about them. Rabbi Meir Franco, because we are a community that's learning about the great Sephardic rabbis of yesteryear. So let's maybe say a word within regards to Rabbi Franco. A few words. I think he, the Jewish Telegraph Agency, I'm not sure the exact date when he passed away. I'll have to double check on that. He was the last of the 3 Sephardic rabbis of Hebron, and I think he passed away at the age of 65 years old. He was, let's just say, had been ailing since, I think, the 1929 August riots. Obviously, we spoke about it well, and he never recovered from the shock of having witnessed the murder of his two colleagues, Rabbi Hassun and Rabbi Castel. That's what's reported over. We can try and maybe find out some more information. He was a key figure, Rabbi Meir Franco was, and recommend everyone to learn more about him. There's actually a good article also, I think, from Arutz Sheva, which speaks about the Sephardic perspective on Hebron that actually occurred. There's actually an in-depth article over here, maybe tomorrow, or you know what, maybe we will speak about this now over here, because we're a community that is exploring the Sephardic rabbinic history. This is actually quoted, I think. The article in Arutz Sheva is called "A Sephardic Perspective of Hebron." Through the long years of exile from Eretz Yisrael, Hebron, like Jerusalem, generally had a sparse number of Jews living there. In 1166, at the young age of 31, Maimonides wrote, "And on the first day of the week, the 9th day of Av, I left Jerusalem for Hebron to kiss the graves of my forefathers, cave of Marat Machpelah." And you know what? I think, so this is the article. Our father Abraham selected Hebron as the first home for the Jewish people to settle in the land of Israel. There, Abraham purchased the historic cave of Machpelah. Other than Jerusalem, Hebron is indeed the holiest location for the Jewish people. The city is mentioned in the Torah over 70 times. Abraham removed his tent and came and lived there in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar to Hashem. Hebron is a place where Sarah died and was buried. Hebron was King David's first capital. Even before Jerusalem, Jewish archaeologists in Hebron have uncovered pottery, jewelry, and ancient homes from the time period of Abraham and Sarah. Unfortunately, Hebron, like all of the land of Israel, had been under foreign occupation for 2,000 years. Even so, there had always been a small number of Jews living in the holy cities. Through the long years of exile from the land of Israel, Hebron, like Jerusalem, generally had a sparse number of Jews living there. In 1166, at the young age of 31, Maimonides wrote, "And on the first day of the week, 9th day of the month of Cheshvan, I left Jerusalem for Hebron to kiss the graves of my forefathers in the cave of Machpelah. And on that very day, I stood in the cave and I praised God for everything." During Turkish rule, which lasted from the 16th century until only 19 years ago, this is at the time of the article was written, Jews from all over the Ottoman Empire migrated to the holy city of Hebron. As early as 1333, Rabbi Isaac Hillel of Greece mentioned the Jews of Hebron, reporting that they were working in the cotton trade and glassworks. In 1517, the Ottoman Turks took control of the land of Israel, and with them came a slaughter of Jews of Hebron. A certain Menachem ben Moshe Bavli, author of Sefer Ta'amei HaMitzvot, migrated from Ottoman Baghdad and became one of the pioneers to settle in Hebron after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. Many of the Spanish Jews came from the western part of the Ottoman Empire to Hebron with Chacham Malkiel Ashkenazi. There is noted a resettlement of the Jews in Hebron in 1540. The influx of Iberian Jews in the 16th century raised the Jewish population of Hebron to a point of it higher than it had been since Roman times, nearly 1,500 years prior. Upon making Aliyah, the great 15th century Sephardic Rabbi Ovadia of Bartner of Italy, wrote, "Over the cave of Machpelah is a large building of Ishmaelites who regard the sacred site with fear and awe. No person, Jew or Ishmaelite, is allowed to descend to the cave, and there is a small window in the outer wall of the building, which is above the grave of Abraham, and there the Jews are allowed to pray. In Hebron live 20 Jewish families, all of them scholars, some of them descendants of Moranos, who came to find refuge under the wings of the divine presence. I lived in Hebron for many years." Now we're speaking about the history of the Jews in Hebron. Jews not only migrated to Hebron, but Hebron's Jews ventured away to other communities for the purpose of raising funds and teaching, from Barbados to Bulgaria, London to Morocco. They traversed the dangerous highways and treacherous seas as missionaries of their community more than 2 centuries ago. Abraham Revere went abroad to raise funds for printing a book his father Mordechai had written. Abraham's father was the head of the rabbinical court in the 18th century. Mordechai had written a religious manuscript that was eventually published at Livorno in 1793. another printed in Saloniki over 40 years later. Ibrahim of Hebron was born in Fez, Morocco, as an emissary of Hebron. He traveled from community to community seeking tzedakah, charity, for Talmud Torah at Hebron. Sadly, while traveling on his most honorable mission in monastery, Abraham died. From the Balkans, now we're going to continue this article over here. Came Moshe ben Abraham, Pereira of Sarajevo. Pereira traveled to Eretz Israel in 1823 and became head of the rabbinical court of Hebron. He died 4 decades later in 1864. Even though Smyrna, Izmir and Hebron were both considered part of the Sultan's empire, Smyrna could not compare to the holiness of Eretz Israel for the spiritual Jew. For this reason, Sephardim migrated from one location of the Ottoman Empire to another, from the freezing mountains of Macedonia to the hot deserts of Syria, and from the Mediterranean islands of Greece to the Golden Horn of Constantinople they came. One notable was Rabbi or Chacham Yosef Raphael ben Haim Yosef Hazan, but relocated from Smyrna to Hebron, later becoming the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. We've spoken about him before on various occasions before. In 1858, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Sliman Mani traveled from Ottoman Baghdad to Hebron and was elected chief rabbi of the city. He remained as chief rabbi of the place for 40 years, passing away at the age of 75. Now, friends, it's getting late. I'm going to continue this article tomorrow, and we're going to do a part 2 of Hebron, the Jewish history of Hebron, recounting also the problems there's been in Hebron, the good times in Hebron. The special edition here, as it happens to be Tisha B'Av over here. So hopefully there'll be the rebuilding of the third Beit HaMikdash now, and blessings all over the world. And everyone, hope you're going to fast safely and make it meaningful Tisha B'Av. Pray as much as you can, and just see good things all over the world. Wishing you all a important night and meaningful fast to everyone. Thank you for watching.